Welcome back to another episode of The Conversation. I'm Onjalé Scott Price, and I'm joined by my wonderful, honorable, fantastic, amazing Reverend Will Mebane. So excited that we get to join you all in another conversation this month. So if you've watched a few episodes before, you've seen that we generally have some theme that goes along with racism. So we've talked about racism in the arts, in sports, in education. Today we're going to do a little bit different. We're going to talk a little bit broader. We're going to talk about racism and stereotypes. So something that I think we're all going to be able to relate to. There's multiple different types of stereotypes, unfortunately, but today we're going to focus on stereotypes and how they perpetuate racism. So looking forward to this conversation today. We will turn it over to our people on the street to talk about how do stereotypes perpetuate racism. So let's hear what they have to say.
So when I think about stereotypes, I think about racist ideas. I believe that most stereotypes are racist ideas. And actually, Ibram X. Kendi speaks about this a lot, where most racist ideas come from racist policies. So a lot of the stereotypes that we have today that are still affecting people of color and Black people in the community come from racist ideas, which initially started from racist policies. Because a lot of stereotypes tend to be in our biases. And a bias is a biological function where we save mental resources by using things that we already know in the back of our head and it's not conscious. And so we tend, if we have an idea of a group or a culture that we do not know a lot about, we tend to use our bias, which can be stereotypes and racist ideas.
I believe that stereotypes overly simplify the complexity, diversity, and richness of humans, and they reduce a whole category of people to a few very simple and often biased features. So they tend to emphasize the negative features of people and ignore the positive. And it seems that humans like to simplify their environment and categorize their environment in ways that make their world understandable to them. So stereotypes tend to feed into that need of humanity.
Well, with stereotypes, we assume something about people just based on who they are or what they look like, right? Whether they're man or woman, Black or white, or of their religion. And usually when we talk about stereotypes, we're assuming something negative or limiting about somebody, right? So we get used to white men being people we see in power, and we think of them as being good leaders, and maybe Black people not being good leaders. And so when we have those kind of implicit biases kind of built in, we just kind of perpetuate these the policies that keep white men in power or prohibit Black men, Black women from getting into positions of power.
So we've just heard from our people on the street answering the question, how do stereotypes perpetuate racism? So I'm really looking forward to this conversation and seeing where we go. So I'm really excited that we have a couple guests with us today. So first, I'd like to pass it over to Karen Rinaldo, an artist who's been in Falmouth since 1972, and her dedication to history made her known as a visual historian. And you can visit her art at her gallery on Main Street called Gallery on Main Street. So Karen, I'd like to pass it over to you and hear a little bit about what you thought of the comments from the people on the street, or if you have any other thoughts about how stereotypes perpetuate racism.
Well, I did. I appreciated those interviews. I have a couple of comments, and I think they would fit in with their comments. My initial feeling was, is racial stereotype a learned behavior, or is it an innate facility of one's conditioning or upbringing? Is it family influence? Is it influenced by friends or a working environment? Is it an environmental condition, I guess? And in that then would play society at large, society's perspective. And then, into that all plays in biased feelings and prejudice. There's a whole host of other components that involved in that. So those are my comments based on the off the street comments by people on the street.
Yeah, good questions. I hope we get a chance to dig into some of those thoughts. Thank you for those. Talia, I'd like to ask you your thoughts. Talia is a Mashpee Wampanoag tribal citizen, videographer, journalist, and filmmaker, currently focusing her work on promoting educational and cultural programs for tribal community and working on partnerships with state education institutions to advocate and benefit Native American students, which is really, really awesome. Great work that you're doing. So I'd love to hear what you think about how stereotypes perpetuate racism.
Yeah, I mean, what everybody said on the street was definitely valid and things to consider within that thought process. But I don't think that you can have stereotypes without racism. Like the same concept that creates stereotypes comes from the same concepts that created racism. So you can't have one without the other. Stereotypes, I feel like, is just a broader term for what essentially is a judgment based off of perceptions. And so obviously, I mean, stereotypes definitely perpetuate racism because they are, I think, point blank and simple.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Can't remember who it was. Somebody on the street did make a comment that racism it supports stereotypes and vice versa. So the more that we have stereotypes and that we repeat them, the more it makes racism, the more it supports racism and racist ideas. So I absolutely agree. I'll pass it over to my wonderful co-host, Rev. Rev, what are your thoughts on how stereotypes perpetuate racism?
Please keep calling me wonderful. I love it when you do that, Angie. First of all, welcome, Karen. Good to see you. Talia, great to see you. I think it was, gosh, over a year ago when we last had you on the show, and you taught us something in that show, which
Yes.
Angie and I still hold very dear, about stereotypes and what have you. So, yeah, I liked what folks on the street had to say and what Karen and Talia have shared also. And I loved especially what Chandler said, that most stereotypes are racist ideas that come from racist policies, right? So you have these policies, and I'm going to go back to my youth when I was raised in the South. I won't call it the deep South, but it was deep enough. I was raised in North Carolina during the Jim Crow era. I was raised in that time when there were segregated drinking fountains with signs, colored only or white only. I was raised in that time when seating on buses was segregated. Black people were sheltered to the back and not being able to go into restaurants, or at least not in the front door. You have to go around the back to the side door, and sort of they toss your food out to you. They take you money, but you couldn't go in to sit down. And I, as a child, I didn't get that, and I don't think I was any different from anyone else. It was just, why? And so then when I started matriculating through high school, and I was among the earliest classes to integrate my high school there in Durham, North Carolina, and began to be confronted with these stereotypes. I played sports, right? And so the belief was that black athletes, football players, for instance, couldn't play quarterback just because you're black. And I never understood that, right? And so anyway, so I grew up having to deal with these stereotypes, and of course I still have them today. I'll give you just a couple of examples. One locally and one in another community where I served as a dean of a cathedral. And I'll never forget, I was standing there one day with my colleague who was my assistant, and there were some people unfamiliar to us that came in, some visitors to the cathedral, and so I'm standing there next to my assistant who's white, and they immediately went to him to introduce themselves and to talk about what a beautiful cathedral it was and how glad they were they had come, and et cetera, et cetera. And then finally he said, my assistant said, well, would you like to meet our dean, who was standing, I was standing right there next to them. Would you like to meet our dean? And the color just went completely out of the faces of these white individuals, because they realized, I think they realized that they were perpetuating a stereotype. And that stereotype was, of course, a black person could not be dean of a cathedral. My gosh, really? A black person could have that position? And then I come to Falmouth, and I hadn't been in Falmouth very long. And I've told this story on the conversation, I think, a couple of times, but it still just resonates with me. It still sticks with me 3.5 years later. There was a Friday night. I came home. It was late, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I pulled into the to what we call Holy Road, the driveway that leads into St. Barnabas's, and I see fire engines all over the place. And so I get out, curious about what was going on, of course, and a member of the Falmouth Fire and Rescue comes over to me and he says, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. So glad we've been waiting for the caretaker." And I was like, okay. He said, "You're the caretaker, right?" And I was able to think quickly enough to say to him, "Yeah, I take care of the souls of the people here in St. Barnabas, but we actually have another person who is our property manager, and I think that's who you're looking for, and he's on his way." He texted me and said he's on his way. So those are just a couple of examples of how stereotypes have been perpetuated in my life, and even when people come to the parish, to see a black person as an Episcopal priest is very unusual, and because the stereotype is, one, not many black people are members of the Episcopal Church, which is true, and two, there are very few black people in the Episcopal Church. So stereotypes, yeah, they're all around, and unfortunately, like Professor Faiman-Silva said in her remarks, stereotypes oversimplify the richness of human beings. We diminish people when we restrict them to stereotypes, and often the stereotypes, especially when it comes to people of color, are negative. One of the biggest stereotypes is that all black folks are poor, or all black folks, or most black folks are criminals, or most black homes don't have two parents in them. And those are all just grossly exaggerated and not even close to being true. So, yeah, those are my initial comments, Angie.
I just want to take a step back just a little bit. You mentioned that you grew up in the Jim Crow era, and so you lived through segregation and separate water fountains and not being able to go to the front door. And I just want to take a moment to appreciate that, because I know when I was taught in school about segregation, and I wasn't really taught about Jim Crow, I learned that later. It's always made to seem like it was so long ago, like we're so far past that. It's so far behind us in our history, and they only show us the black and white photos to make it seem even older. When I say they, I mean books and media and whatnot. And it really perpetuates, I don't know if it's necessarily a stereotype, but it perpetuates this image that was so long ago and we're over it and we should forget about it. We don't see the remnants of that today. But Rev, you're still young. You're still out here living life, and yet that you remember that. So it wasn't even like when you were super young, like you remember that, and being part of one of the first schools that integrated. I just think that we should appreciate that history is not as old as we are often made to feel like it is.
Wasn't that long ago, and I appreciate you saying that I'm still relatively young. Thank you. Talia, let me ask you that question. Being an indigenous person, I'm proud member of the Wampanoag Nation. You individually, and I am going to assume members of your nation have also had to deal with all kinds of stereotypes. I can think of a couple coming to mind right now as I'm asking that question, but what kind of stereotypes have been perpetuated to perpetuate racism against indigenous peoples like the Wampanoag?
I mean, I think the most of interactions with natives and non-natives, as far as like when you meet, perpetuates a stereotype within the non-native, because there is so few of us, in America that I don't think as many people are exposed to Native Americans. So their first, presumptions when meeting a Native American, they have very stereotypical responses or questions. And that is just something that we literally deal with on a day-to-day basis. Some of the things, I guess, or the questions, I would say, that perpetuate basically the stereotype of what Native Americans are, or what happens to us is like, don't you go to school for free? Stuff, just general stuff. It's hard to like think of everything because they're all like flooding at once, and it's because within my age now, I'm very used to just like dealing with it, I guess, and having a correct response to those in a humbling way that they don't really come right off the bat. But
But let me see if I can help you, because
Yep.
I'm holding a couple, and maybe
Okay.
that'll help your floodgates break open. Not that we want to traumatize you or anyone here. That's not what this show is about. But I was taught, and one of the stereotypes is that Indians, quote unquote, are all alcoholics. They drink all the time, and that they're all violent, right? Am I right or wrong about that?
Yeah, I'm very angry,
Yeah.
that's definitely a stereotype for natives, that, we don't know how to conduct ourselves, I guess, in a civilized way, is one of those ancient stereotypes that basically is what formed America today. And we talked about this, the point brought up a little earlier about how, is stereotypes and racism something that you're brought up basically learning like through parenting and stuff like that? Well, that is, I think, a big part of it, but also is what is taught in school. And what is taught in school or in today's American society is it supports what American society wants to perpetuate within their own stereotype. And within that, they perpetuate stereotypes within Native Americans. And we're just trying to I think, breaking through with combating that, on a state and public level, where more people are trying to be more conscious of, really saying the other side of history and really telling it is for what it is. Because a lot of the like first encounter documents will describe Native Americans in a certain way, but they're always written from a certain perspective, and it perpetuates stereotypes. And this stereotype has literally been happening to us since the first colonizers came over, and it's a colonized mentality that has stuck throughout. And so people perpetuate that within talking and meeting Native Americans for the first time. And then they also assume certain things, because we even have to deal with it within our, local press, of them holding on to certain stories or delivering stories in a certain way that don't fully convey exactly what happened, or really just like narrow in on to perpetuate a stereotype of violence, or just sort of some sort of mayhem that's coming from the tribe, without actually, you know, talking about what we do and what's good and stuff like that. You know, they pick up on the negative, and it's to keep up with exactly what you're saying, with that violent and kind of alcoholic mindset. And I think it is to kind of dull down and amplify this persona of what Americans want America to look like, of what they formed this great society for, you know. And I think it just it keeps that up, you know, and it makes it harder for us to be able to tell our side of the story, since it's never really been heard or appreciated or respected. I think that got a little too deep, but
No, we
Oh.
do that here though, huh?
we do that here. So I want to ask Karen to comment on that a little bit, because Karen, you mentioned when I was asking you about, you know, what should I say about you? What's a good part of your biography? One point that really stood out was because of your dedication to history, you became known as the visual historian. And so I'm sure that means that you had to get past a lot of stereotypes and a lot of BS and other things to get to the meat of what you were looking for to display it visually. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done?
Well, several things that Talia had commented on really went to the heart of a few things that I could relay. You know, I'm a very visual person just by nature of my commitment to my work. But I'll also add that I'm a very colorblind person in terms of how I interact or my relationships with people. One of the projects that I had that became pretty noted in the world of art was a commission to construct the first historically accurate first Thanksgiving, 1621. And Talia is probably very familiar with this image. But it goes to the heart of, you know, 400 years, how do we wrap our minds around understanding something that happened 400 years ago? And yet one of my closing comments on presentations that we've made with this image of the first Thanksgiving is that in 400 years, not much has changed in terms of all the conditioning of a nation. You know, you talk about prejudice or stereotypes, but the history as a nation has perpetuated certain aspects. But so in those closing comments I make, I say in 400 years, not much has changed. You know, you have the natives on one side, you had the pilgrims all together at that first day celebration. And I use that word celebration only to kind of capsulize the event. It was a celebration in terms of they had both survived very tough times in terms of epidemic, pandemic, a journey that left several people in desperate state of minds, and then surviving a first harsh winter. So you had two elements, two cultures coming together that had both been survivors. And in that vein, I use the word celebration, not in terms of gaiety and fun and a celebratory mood. But, you know, you think about, so not much has changed. In that image that's being conveyed, you're showing people who are striving for peace, people who are striving to protect their families, to have some happiness within living conditions, and to be able to pursue a way of life, pursuit of happiness, you know, that really comes back to what it's all about. But to Talia's points, I think, you know, a couple of things that I opened up in the opening comments, society at large creates a perspective, and a perspective that's relatively based in that aspect of bias, feelings, and a prejudiced feeling. But our history as a nation has also perpetuated that. One of the words that jumps out at me going back to 400 years ago was a word that was quite common in the culture, and that was the word savage. That was a word that was used to describe the native people. But it was a language at that time. Is it an acceptable language? Today, of course not, but it was a language definitely then. And you know, I think it comes down to educating the youth, re-educating an older society, because they have been caught up in and familiar with this type of climate. We talk about climate change in relationship to the environment. Well, it's definitely a climate change that has to exist within people's reactions and that responsible feeling that they have for one another. It really comes down to a do-good policy between people. And until people can react in a loving each other state of mind, I think that perpetuation of those differences becomes greater, because the fact is we have far greater similarities with all cultures than we have differences. And that's another thing that I say in those closing comments, that we're all different as people, but our similarities are far greater than those differences.
Now, that is certainly true. And thank you, Karen. As an artist, I know you have dedicated your work to your professional work to trying to help eradicate stereotypes. At least that's my understanding of some of your work. I can't say that I'm a student of yours, but I do pay attention to your work. And, you know, Talia, you sort of apologizing about, you know, going so deep. And as Angie said, that is okay. That's what the conversation is about. It's about having deep conversations about very difficult topics. And we know that talking about race and talking about racism is still very difficult for us. It's just something that Angie has said before. It's families don't have conversations about racism around the dinner table. Even if they're meeting for dinner, because so many of us are eating and independently of one another. But the point is that we don't have these kinds of conversations. And I really appreciated what, again, you know, Professor Faiman-Silva said about this is something that we perpetuate these stereotypes in order, if I'm remembering her and quoting her correctly, we perpetuate these stereotypes in order to accommodate what is going on within ourselves. That we need stereotypes to help carry forward these understandings that we have of other people. And to me, that speaks to a kind of laziness within and among people, right? Instead of, we're going to be talking in a few minutes about, you know, how do we eradicate these stereotypes in order to deal with and eradicate racism. But, you know, this stuff is taught. And I think maybe, Karen, you posed that question, you know, or said something about that. This racism is taught. It is taught by uncles and aunts and cousins and coaches and priests and teachers and mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, right? No one comes into the world with these stereotypes. No one comes into the world thinking, I'm better than you because I'm white and you're black, or you're less than me because you're Wampanoag or you're native and, you know, I'm not. So that gets learned. And
I think it is a learned behavior.
And so that's the thing that, you know, in the struggle against racism, that is the thing that gives me hope. And maybe I'll say more about that when we get to the second question, but let me toss it back to Angie or Talia, whoever would like to make any other comments at this point.
Yeah, I just want to add, it is learned, and then so it might be learned at home or through family, but then it's perpetuated in life. So it's perpetuated in our books and in our media, and for places like Falmouth, as much as I love Falmouth, Falmouth is a very white town. There's not a lot of people of color. Like there are Wampanoag people here, and obviously they're in Mashpee and other places. But if you stay in your little bubble and all you know is the stereotypes you've been taught or that you've read or that you've watched in movies, and you never actually interact with people, or you never have that stereotype challenge, you're going to perpetuate those racist ideas because that's all you know, and you don't have anything to challenge those ideas. When I was in college, I was an RA, I was a resident advisor. And I remember one of my other RA friends called me late one night and asked me to come over and help with a situation with a student. And so I get there, and there is a student of Asian descent who is threatening to harm himself. And so we're trying to have conversation with him, and we're trying to get to like what is happening, how can we help you, what is the problem. And what it came down to was he was an engineering student, and he was really struggling in his courses. I, as an engineering student, also struggled in my courses. But the difference was, he said, I'm Asian, I'm supposed to be smart, I'm supposed to be really good at math and science, and people are asking me for help in class because I'm Asian, and I'm supposed to be this and that, and I'm not these things, and I don't know how to handle it. And so that was me realizing that even good stereotypes, that Asian kids are smart and good at science and math and they're all successful, that's a horrible stereotype, even though it seems like it's a good one. And that really put in perspective, and something that I think about quite often is, he hadn't even been challenged in his own life to think that that stereotype was a stereotype and that it was okay to not fit into that mold. So I really think that stereotypes and racist behavior in general are learned and then unfortunately just perpetuated. But like you said, Rev, I think there is some hope in knowing that if we understand that it's taught, then we can not teach it.
But another thing to add to the equation, I think, is the actual profiles and personas are taught. So obviously taking away those personas will help, not aid the process, but it also stems from judgment and people feeling like they can judge people, because we could actually stop all this if we just didn't have prejudgments or judge people based off of anything. If you just kind of met people when you meet people, and genuinely lived out a genuine life, and I think the reason why I say that is one of like the big differences that I can see within cultures of American society and within my own culture or Americans, and that mentality is the big difference that you see is there's always like this prejudgment or this like manipulation or some sort of tactic to get to another goal or like a result, rather than being genuine and taking life for what it is, being thankful for what you have every day and learning and being open, and having that mentality will also help us break down and notice these personas that are being taught. Because if we remember that, if these teachers and, preachers and stuff remember that part of it, like it comes from a judgment as well, then they can maybe open up that door when they're conveying their, things that they have to convey, whether it be a syllabus or scripture or however it may be.
That's an interesting take on that. I think that kind of points also to this, what I call like the hustle culture in American culture, that you always have to be doing something. You always gotta get more and outdo the next person. And you gotta be the best, and like grind culture, like don't sleep because you gotta do better than the next person. So that really resonates, like you said, on like a whole, just the way we live scale is like we always have to have more and do more, which means you got to be better than somebody else, which means you got to judge somebody else and see how you can get in a place that's better than where they are, or gain something from
root to unhappiness, that right there.
So, American dream, right?
Yeah, that's reminding me of what Chandler said in her comments from the street, and I would love to know more about it. So I'll ask Karen and Talia, and you, Angie, maybe to flesh this out a little more if you can. But she was talking about bias. I think her quote was, bias is a biological function that we use to save resources. I guess this goes back to the point about humans are just lazy, right? So we use stereotypes as sort of a shorthand for the world, but also with ourselves. And so our these things are subconscious. They're in the back of our minds. So yeah, is it a biological function, or is it just that it's so embedded that it becomes, because of the indoctrination, because again, family members and teachers and coaches and priests and whatever, drilling in these stereotypes into folks, or is there something else going on? What do you think?
Will, if I may address that, I think it is almost like an inoculation. You are surrounded by certain things, going back to, is it an environmental play? Is it family oriented? Is it the people that you associate with business wise or in a social casual basis? But whatever those combinations of situations are, you are inoculating yourself with those entities. And I think, again, it goes back to educating and re-educating, educating the youth and re-educating an older population, because otherwise it's impossible to escape the visual. I mean, you see differences between people just based on visual observation, how they're dressed, what they're wearing, how they look, how their attitude. And again, I say for myself, from my own point of view, I'm colorblind when it comes to that. And yet I'm a very visual person. Yet I don't see those gradations of darker skinned people or very dark people. I see people as people. Not everybody sees people as human beings. They see them as different categories. And that's where I feel the education is so important. If families don't have, the family structure, or as you said, the conversation at dinner, if there's a lot of distraction, we never get to the heart, to the root of that problem. So I think it's a whole host of things that create that inoculation of misinformation.
Yeah, you both have mentioned education, Talia and Karen. You've mentioned education a few times, and so it makes me wonder what you think about the current climate we're operating in now with the banning of books and curriculum. Is that to perpetuate stereotypes? Do the books that are being banned challenge those stereotypes? And so the dominant culture, predominantly the white dominant culture, wants to remove that because they don't want the truth revealed. What do you have to say about this climate in which we find ourselves?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I've read the banned books, and I've looked at the list of the continuing banned books, or just the things that are discouraged on the landscape of on that subject. And I think it's important to understand where that, in order to understand the problem, you have to understand where the problem is generating from. And so you almost have to go back to the culprit. What is it that starts that whole atmosphere? Within that, then, are there things that need to be removed or put in a different category? I think it becomes almost a dangerous thing to remove all of history from the plate. I think it's more important to understand what we have in front of us, because that's educating as well, to understand that which is uncomfortable to accept or not accept, but it helps us to move forward. I think it becomes difficult to move forward if we're not looking back at what it was that got us to this point,
Exactly.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, why censor? There's no reason to censor anything. And I don't agree with taking, certain things down, because you're exactly right. We need to learn, and people need to learn so they realize, but it has to be taught the right way, so
Exactly.
when you're teaching this material, you have to come with that perception. I mean, the only thing I think that should be taken out is like really just wonky stuff that people just write about things and aren't really factual, like obviously. But with censoring, there's no reason to censor history, because that's what's created society right now. And I think people know society right now needs to change. They know something's wrong, but are they willing to look at it and really fess up to it? And you guys brought up, not talking about these certain things at the kitchen table. Like, why not? Why aren't people doing that? Coming from a Native family, like you talk about it because you have to, because that's what's literally tried to wipe out our existence. And every single day we have to execute our culture in a way so we don't cease to exist. And so with that, we have to understand racism. We have to understand the stereotypes that people perpetuate. And we have to understand the American society that we have to step in each and every day, or we wouldn't be able to be here and function and be able to take care of the resources that it's our right, being our birthright to have to do, it's our obligation, I should say, to do. So that does worry me. I mean, I know that, at least within some cultures, that they don't like to talk about things, because clearly that's what history has taught within censorship, within education and just society. But why aren't people talking about it at the kitchen table, I wonder, now,
Yeah, I'm going to kick it over to you, Angie, but Karen and Talia have my mind racing here. So yeah, great question. So why aren't we having these conversations at the kitchen table? And as you were talking about that, Talia, I was thinking about, what happens around, you were saying around the table of a Native family. You're going to have those conversations because you have to, because as you said earlier, you're dealing with this stuff every day. It's just coming at you. Racism is just coming at you. Macro aggressions, microaggressions are just coming at you constantly. So, you get home and you're around the dinner table and you gotta have these conversations. Otherwise, you're gonna go crazy, right? Literally. And so it made me think about another subject that's in the news right now, and that is the killing of Amir Locke over in Minnesota. And this is the case of the officers going in with a no-knock warrant, and within, I've heard 10 seconds, 9 seconds, 7 seconds, but very quickly shooting and killing this 22-year-old black man. I wonder, and this is a question really for our audience, for those of you listening in on the conversation, on this conversation, I want you to be honest and ask yourselves, how many conversations have you had around your table about Amir Locke since this happened? I can tell you that around practically every black table, kitchen table, in every living room, dining room, wherever, black folks are talking about it. We're talking about it for lots of reasons. But I wonder how many white folks are having conversations about what happened with Amir Locke. Some, I'm sure some are. But is that again a perpetuation of a stereotype? Well, he had it coming to him. And if he wasn't guilty of this, he was probably guilty of something else anyway. So, so I just put that question out there and tossed it to you, Angie.
Well, I think that we should give our audience a break to really think about that question. And when we come back, we'll be hearing from the people on the street answering our second question: how do we address the issues of racial stereotypes? So let's hear from people on the street, but maybe pause this first and think about that question that Rev just posed.
Yeah, so I think, the first way to address it is that we have to understand, kind of where it's coming from and the implicit biases that are leading to those stereotypes and leading to those actions. And so that takes a lot of work on our side, for us to look within ourselves and try to understand why we see people certain ways and how maybe we can change the way we're viewing people. I think we need policies as well to help do that, but that's not always enough. I mean, I think currently, there's this incident going on with the National Football League, where they've attempted to address some of the injustices and hiring practices that we've seen in head coaching and other staff by requiring the teams to interview people of color when they're hiring these positions. And that's a great idea, and that helps ensure that people are getting opportunities. But if the people that are making those hires aren't really working on themselves to understand their implicit biases and how that affects who they're hiring, it's not always going to come out as the kind of change enacted that we'd like to see, which has led to this case of Brian Flores against the NFL. So we need to change our policies to make sure everybody has opportunities to succeed. And then we also need to look within ourselves and make sure that when we're in positions of power to hire people or pull people in to do things, that we're really trying to consider people as people and not making assumptions of how well they might do in a position based on their gender, their color, their religion, or qualities like that.
One great way to kind of counteract stereotypes is to learn about your bias. Not only learning that you have a bias that's unintentional, where it might have racist ideas of cultures and different people from different backgrounds than yourself, that you might use to jump to conclusions about people. Checking your bias by stopping and thinking, does this idea in my head have any merit? Where does this idea come from before I speak to this person? Yeah, it's unintentional. And we know that most of the time when we're using these biases from stereotypes we've heard, that we don't mean to be harmful, but we have to stop and think, why am I saying this? Is there any merit, or am I making an assumption about this person just because of the way that they look?
Well, as a professor, I taught about stereotypes in many of my courses, and I sometimes or often used an example of Canada and Canadian hockey players. And I asked the students, is being good at hockey an innate attribute? Is it something that's innate to Canadians uniquely? And is that why so many Canadians are excellent hockey players? And the students immediately realized that that was rather absurd, and that no, it was because Canada's a country that has a lot of snow. It's a cold country. There are a lot of opportunities to learn hockey and to ice skate. And it really has nothing to do with innateness. Essentially, again, it's something that's learned, and we can't apply that same way of thinking to other people, to assume that just because they're good at something, or a lot of people are good or have certain attributes, that those are innate. Again, it's rooted in stereotypes and the tendency for people to categorize groups in ways that are easy to understand and familiar to them. And I do urge people to avoid stereotyping. and to really look at people in much more complex ways. Otherwise, you demean people, you dehumanize them, and you don't really get to know them as human beings.
So we've just heard from our people on the street answering the question, how do we address the issues of racial stereotypes? So I'd like to open it up to the panel to either comment on anything they heard or to add your own thoughts on, okay, we've discussed at length the issues of stereotypes and how they perpetuate racism. What do we do about it?
So we know that stereotypes exist. We know that people have biased feelings about other people. And there's that element too that says you don't discuss sex, religion, and politics, not at the dinner table, not in a business setting, because it's an inflammatory, all three are inflammatory subjects. But again, if you're not able to have the conversation at the dinner table in a familiar surrounding, where in the world are you going to have that conversation? And so if it's not starting there and you're afraid to have it in a public forum, you're never going again to the heart of the issue. So whether you have familiarity with the subject on a personal level, whether you are or a family member is, I'm not sure if that generates a greater empathy or sympathy or understanding of, but I think it comes down to how one treats another person with respect and the dignity that human beings deserve. And if that has to be a learned quality, it's kind of sad to think that it does. I would hope that that is an innate quality. But if it isn't an innate quality and it has to be treated in a learned teaching environment, then again, it goes to education. And I don't mean to be profound in comments. And as you said, I don't think you can ever go too deep or be too profound. I think, and I get very emotional about race and ethnic groups, and because I just see people as people, and as simplistic as that may sound, it really goes to the heart of how we treat brotherhood. What is brotherhood if it isn't accepting and allowing people to prosper and live out their lives in happiness, to be able to work, to be able to have family life, to be able to run a business without constraints and without those parameters of biased feelings. I think it comes down to how we treat each other as people, not as separations or segregated communities or personalities or figures. We're people, and we deserve that dignity and respect.
So I definitely hear you, Karen, and I wholeheartedly agree we need to treat people as people. I do feel like, though, it's important to take someone's ethnicity or their color, as you could say, into consideration when talking to people. And I'll use Talia as an example, because Talia came on the show last time and blew our minds by reminding us that Native Americans, Indigenous people are here year round. We can talk to them in any time other than November when we think about them for Thanksgiving. And we talk about that all the time, and just how important it was for us to hear that. But by looking at Talia and recognizing that she's an Indigenous person, it makes me realize that she's going to have a different story than I am. So even if I do think of Talia and everybody as a person, and I want to treat everyone equally, but I think it's important to consider that the way that they look means that other people have treated them differently. And so they're gonna, when I go into their space or have conversation with them or anything like that, I need to consider what their perspectives might be based on how they've been treated by other people based on how they look. So I totally understand the idea of being colorblind. And I think that in a moral sense is a really good way to be, is just, if you are a human, I'm going to treat you as a human. But I think taking into account the way someone looks is not to be stereotypical and say, okay, because Talia is a Native person, XYZ, but to say, I recognize that Talia is indigenous, and actually maybe she would prefer to be called indigenous than Native. So maybe that's something that I should consider asking her. Just keeping in mind those kinds of things, I think, are really important when talking to people of different colors or different hues.
Yeah, I think to the point too, though, is that's where the respect comes in, so that's the way that we consider, the way that someone's look or their race or ethnicity is that respect point. As long as we keep that respect within that, and the way that we speak to people and the way that we encounter people, and not perpetuate the stereotype. And like legit what she was just saying is respect each other, respect our stories, respect each other's persons, all of that, our history and who we are, and stop bringing that prejudgment. Like it's that, colonized mentality of having the superior being, of thinking that we have the entitlement to judge people in any sort of way, either based off the way that they look or just who they are as a person, based off of what we hear from them. That's an entitlement that we carry within ourselves. Why do we care? Why do some people carry that? And looking at that, and really just, if people recognize that and say, just try to prioritize respecting each other, respecting someone else is also respecting you, and remembering that you don't have to compare yourself to respect each other, or respect yourself. You don't have to compare to respect yourself, So it's that whole respect and trying to hear one another out and learn things for what they are, and not putting up that imagery as well, not perpetuating that imagery, not teaching the constant stereotype. And when we look at history, we look at it for what it is and look at both counts of every sides of every story, and not just this, narrative that keeps on this persona of what society wants it to be.
I think it was Chandler also made a really good point along those lines of, she said, when stereotypes, we think of them, we should challenge them. It's like, what is this idea based on? Is this based on something that I've heard, something that I've seen, something that I've been told, or is this a stereotype that, all stereotypes have to come from somewhere, but where is this coming from? And challenge that, and challenge where that comes from. So if you realize that you're getting stereotypes from media, I'll go back to the example of the young Asian man who I went to college with. It's like, when I start paying attention in movies, almost always the computer science nerd, the person in the movie, is almost always Asian. And I've started to notice that people on social media are recognizing this as well. And so now when I see an Asian person and I think, oh, I wonder if that's the computer science major. Ooh, Anji, why did you think that? Don't think that. And then think about where I think I got that from, and try to make sure that I'm changing that mentality, and I'm not perpetuating stereotypes by then asking the student, oh, are you the computer science major in the group of students? What do you think, Rev?
Don't ask me that. I'm thinking so many things. Oh gosh. Oh my God. This is good stuff. This is really good stuff. So a couple things. So it is about relationships, right? We've been talking about that. Yes, if we get to know people different from ourselves, we begin to discover that there are fewer differences and more things that make us alike. But I want to share a personal thing here. So I just reconnected in the last 4 or 5 months with a former classmate, and we haven't been in touch in 50 years. 50 years, and we were friendly towards one another when we were in high school. But she shared with me that her father was a racist. And so she would not allow herself to cross the line to really getting to know me, because she was intimidated by her father. She wanted to be respectful of her father. And that reminded me that so many times when I was in that period of desegregation in the South, and I would get invited to the homes of white kids in high school, and their parents would come out every once in a while, and I would be the only black person there, and they say, "Oh, Willie, you're not like the rest of them." I was like, "Wait a minute, yeah, yeah, I am. I'm just like the other black kids in the school." "Oh, but you're so different." And what I realized is what they were saying is, um, we've gotten to know you a little bit, and so now we have a relationship with you, and so we see that we have more in common than or different. Your interests are the same interests that my son has or my daughter has, right? But I want to go back to Angie. We might have to do another show on this. Because I might be opening a can of worms, but you open the can, so I'm just going to break it open a little bit more. I want to go back to Karen, because your comments about being colorblind, I hear that as sincere from you, and I believe that is a philosophy and a way of being to which you are committed. But what I want to say, Karen, is that if you don't see me as black, you're not seeing me, because I'm black. And because I'm black, I have a different experience in the world than a white person has. So yes, the goal is to not to be controlled by stereotypes or controlled by these negative things around race and racism. But there is some authenticity to someone saying, "I recognize your blackness, and I recognize that you've had a journey that is so different from my own as a white person, and that you're still going through it. And I want to be an accomplice with you in helping to eradicate the racism in the in society." And then I'll say this, and I love what the persons on the street had to say, Sheri and Chandler and Sandy, and and they all talked about that transformation comes from within. We can have all the policies in the world, we can have all the laws in the world, but if the transformation has not occurred within our hearts, we're going to continue to perpetuate the racism. We're going to continue to perpetuate the stereotypes that are there. So we need laws, we need policies, but we also need to change people's hearts. Not just their minds, but change people's hearts. And that's the work in which I'm involved as a priest in the Christian tradition, to try to get people to change their hearts. So
I think we need to encourage people to have these conversations around the kitchen table. As was said, that should be your most comfortable place, is within your home or the home of someone in your family or a close friend. If you're in someone's home having dinner, I like to think that you are in a comfortable place. And if you are unable to have difficult conversations in that comfortable place, I can't imagine that you could have those conversations in public. And those conversations, they have to start somewhere. And so that's one thing that we've really hoped to do with this show, is to start these conversations. We have them amongst ourselves, and we hope that our viewers have them amongst themselves, and have conversations with that racist uncle. Kind of like we were talking off camera about how it seems like everyone now knows or is related to a person from the LGBTQ community. And so that bridges that gap. I feel like a lot of us have that racist uncle that we all know. You just don't talk to them. You just don't invite them into the conversation. But that's what we need to do, because we need to talk to those people, because they are perpetuating the stereotypes and perpetuating the racism. And sometimes maybe we are too and don't realize it, just like we did with Talia on the show the first time. And we didn't realize we were doing it until she told us that we were doing it. And now we know, we recognize that we had internalized that, and we need to do better. So
I think that's a big part within, the change of it all too, but with everything, it's why do we always feel like we need to relate to accept each other? You know, we can accept each other with not being able to relate, because I mean, I can do that. I think a lot of tribal people have to do that, you know, like you don't understand the way that people think sometimes, but you accept that for what it is, and you understand it and you move on. Like you surround your world and your life the way that you want to. And if we all want to have a better and more unified life, then we'll want to stop doing this and stop comparing each other and stop trying to think that we need to relate or be similar in order to respect each other and listen. Because I think a big part of, you know, breaking down this racism is listening, because, you know, a white person necessarily is not going to understand a Native, Black, Hispanic, Asian person's, like, because they don't come from that culture. We might be able to tell them stories, we might be able to get them to realize some things, but something in them might not make that trigger. With the same thing goes vice versa within, you know, white culture and other cultures. Like there'll be certain things that we won't be able to grasp because that's just not the way that we've learned or the way that we are as people. So as long as we can let go of the fact that we're all, you know, we're different, but we're the same, and there's nothing wrong with it. You know?
I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. We should not have to relate to people for them to matter. Like Aaron said, just treat everybody, whether you know them or not, whether you can relate to them or not, whether they look like you or not. Treat people with respect and treat people honestly. And that's how we're gonna do better.
Yep.
Well, this has been a really awesome conversation. I really want to thank you, Karen, for coming in and sharing your perspective, and Talia for coming in and dropping your wisdom as always. Rev, always a pleasure. Love seeing your face. Looking forward to a hug sometime soon. So until the next episode of The Conversation, we thank you all for joining us, and who knows, maybe we'll have you on the show next time. Take care.
Peace,